Hi everyone, I'm Patricia Villarreal.
And I'm Anna Ubals.
And we are part of the team at Bilinguistics. Both Anna and I are bilingual speech-language pathologists. We speak English and Spanish. And we work in several different settings. We work with the early childhood intervention population in the home setting. We work with school-age children in the clinic setting, and we also work in the schools. We're really excited about this presentation, Speech Therapy in the Life Skills Classroom, for two reasons. The first one being that I personally worked in the school setting for a while before I was ever assigned a life skills classroom on my caseload. And when the time came that I did have a life skills classroom on my caseload, I was a little bit overwhelmed and a little bit curious as to how to provide the most effective therapy for this population in this type of a setting. So I got together with Anna, and we looked at the research, we looked at evidence-based practices, and we started pulling things that applied to this population in this setting and figured out, what worked for us. And the second reason why we're excited about this presentation is because once we put together some materials to use, we knew that we were successful in using these materials. We were curious to know if other speech pathologists would have the same level of success. And this has been tried by other speech pathologists that work in our clinic, and we've gotten great responses. So we're excited to share this with you guys today. So let's jump in. This is our disclosure statement. Both Anna and I are salaried employees of Bilinguistics. Let me start off by describing what exactly is a life skills classroom, because I'll be using the term life skills throughout the presentation, so I just want to make sure that we're all clear as to the population of students that we're discussing. These students at the elementary level can be anywhere from kindergartners all the way up until 5th grade. And they have one or more disabilities that can include other health impairment, autism, intellectual disability, a variety of other reasons why these students are eligible for special education services. And they also, most of these students have speech impairments as well. This is a self-contained classroom in which the students are removed from the general education setting for all or part of the day, depending on their needs. We've heard it being called a functional life skills classroom. You may have heard a low incidence classroom. But for the purposes of this presentation, we'll be calling it a life skills classroom, and I'm pretty sure that's the term that's most widely used. So why is it a challenge working with this population? This was a question that we asked ourselves when we were determining what it was that we needed to do in order to develop materials that we could use with this population. And we also asked several speech pathologists last year at a TISHA conference, and we received several responses saying that it was challenging and a little bit overwhelming working with this population because of the variability. There's a lot of variability in grade levels, there's a lot of variability in needs and level of functioning. And as a speech pathologist, we're experts in speech and language. We know what to do. But it's sort of this fight or flight response that we have when we're faced with this population in the school setting. We kind of want to stick to the tools that we know work for us and focus on our speech and language. But when working in a school setting, we also have to think about what is the best way to enhance communication in the school setting, meaning with peers, meaning language that is used in the classroom on a daily basis, meaning how are we going to facilitate interactions with teachers and staff as well. And so this is where we began looking into how are we going to structure our therapy to make this the most effective use of our sessions. We began by looking at our ASHA guidelines, and this says that individualized programs always relate to schoolwork. This is taken from a position statement on ASHA website, and materials for treatment are taken from or are directly related to content from classes. So we want to make sure that what we're doing as far as providing speech therapy in the schools directly relates to what's going on in the classroom. So this is the part where we thought about service delivery models. There are 3 different types of service delivery models. The first one being the speech-language pathologist direct therapy model, also commonly referred to as a pull-out model of therapy, where students are removed from their classroom, they target their speech and language skills directly, and then return to the classroom. And this model is pretty widely used, and it can be effective for many students depending on cognitive levels and whether or not they can generalize what is being taught in the SLP direct therapy session into the classroom. The other service delivery model is a classroom-based indirect model. This is great because with this type of model, the speech-language pathologist goes into the classroom and so is able to use materials that are used in the classroom as well. However, the speech-language pathologist works on a lesson and the teacher works on another lesson. So it's really not a collaboration, although it's all done in the classroom. And the last service delivery model is a classroom-based direct model. This is where the speech-language pathologist and the teacher collaborate to deliver a lesson to all of the students together. And research shows that with children with significant language impairments, this is the best type of model because students make the most progress in their communication. It is a challenging task to set up this type of service delivery model with this population. We have experience with multiple life skills classrooms setting up this type of service delivery model, and it is challenging, but it's rewarding as well because we have seen that students that we work with have made significant progress in their communication in the classroom. And speech-language pathologists learn a lot from teachers. We learn a lot about what their expectations are for the students. And they also pick up on things that we do and begin to implement them throughout the day in the classroom as well. So it's very rewarding to set this type of service delivery model up.
So we wanted to touch briefly on, if you're in Texas, you may have heard of TEKS, and if you're in another state, you're probably hearing the term Common Core Standards. These are important buzzwords that apply to SLPs for a couple of reasons. First of all, as Patricia mentioned, the ASHA guidelines do state that individualized programs need to relate to schoolwork. And second of all, TEKS or Common Core Standards are what our teachers are focused on. So just as we are concerned about IEPs and goals, and this is what drives our therapy planning, the teachers are focused on curriculum standards, and that's what they're using when they're lesson planning. And so as speech pathologists, this can be a great point to begin a conversation with the teacher by understanding what the teacher is concerned with in her classroom. So what exactly are TEKS? TEKS stand for Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills, and they are a set of skills that the state of Texas has determined are essential for each student to learn. Each grade level has a very specific set of TEKS for each content area, and you can find these all on the Texas Educational Agency website or the TEA website. And Common Core is a voluntary national program that Texas is not participating in, And I think there are a lot of emotions that arise with the term Common Core, but today we're not focused on what works or what doesn't work regarding Common Core. Instead, we're focused on the fact that there are a set of skills that school systems are required to cover, regardless of what state you're in. Also, Common Core and TEKS are standards, they're not curriculum. So curriculum defines exactly how and when during the school year these standards are going to be taught. So as speech pathologists, it's important to have an understanding of what the standards are, but also we want to be in sync and in dialogue with the teacher so we know what the curriculum is in order to support our students in the best way possible throughout the school year. So here's a Venn diagram that gives an example of typical speech language goals as well as a specific state standard, and this demonstrates how these two can intersect. So if we look at the language goals, we see answering who and where questions. We see a goal for labeling people and places, and a goal for expanding utterances. And then the specific state standard states for a first grader that they should be able to compare the similarities and differences among the lives and activities of individuals who have influenced the community, state, and nation. So how can these two intersect? Well, take the unit, so just working on community members. You could work on answering questions about community members, labeling community members, and telling where community members work. So again, this is a great way to be able to start a conversation with a teacher and demonstrate how you're able to support him or her and what their needs are in the classroom. And Patricia has a great example of how she was able to collaborate with a life skills teacher in order to target a specific standard.
Yeah, I like this story. It was the beginning of a school year, and I was working on introducing students to school vocabulary and parts of the school and people that they see at school. And so we were talking a little bit about their school life, but also about the community and where they live, things of that nature. And so I decided that for one of the routines in my therapy session, we were going to sing The Wheels on the Bus. So we know that the chorus goes something like, all through the town. In Spanish, it says La Ciudad, which is the city. And as I was doing my first therapy session, the teacher said, oh, that reminds me, I really want all the students to know what city they live in. There's going to be a test coming up. I think it was a state standardized test that he had developed for his students. And he really wanted all of them to know the answer to that question. So I said, you know what, we can incorporate that into our therapy session. And so from that point on, for a couple of weeks after that, every time we sang that chorus throughout the song, we added all through the town in Austin, Texas. And of course, they went with this really cool gesture that you guys can't see. But so we would yell it out like that over and over again. And weeks after the lesson was over, he gave that state exam, and he comes back and he says, you know, every time I sat down with those students individually and he asked them in Spanish, what city do you live in? They all said, all through Austin, Texas, with the gesture. And so we had a nice laugh about that. But it just goes to show that we can work on the same things. And that was targeting their speech and language and communication goals. And it was also targeting an academic goal. So this type of service delivery model really enhanced that communication between the teacher and I, but also enhanced the communication for the students as well.
So at first it can feel pretty overwhelming to be working in a life skills classroom with children with severe levels of impairments and be required to target academic curriculum. And we know as professionals it's our responsibility to expose students to age-appropriate material regardless of their level of functioning. So how do we do this? And this is exactly what drove us to begin capturing what was working for us in the life skills classroom and to begin morphing our small successes over time into a therapy plan that could address the unique needs of several students in the same session. And as we worked on bridging this gap between level of functioning and required school curriculum, it began to morph into this routine-based therapy framework where we could start inserting the teacher's curriculum. And we were having success and began thinking about sharing what we were doing in order that not everyone had to be recreating the wheel. So here at Bilinguistics, we've been working as a team to be putting together a book with various units aligned with school curriculum. But we also wanted to, and we'll be talking a little bit more about what that looks like later on in the presentation, but we wanted to acknowledge that there are other resources out there for working with students in the life skills classroom. So you'll see there's a couple books we've pictured there by Darlene Mannix, and then also we've listed popular websites such as Teachers Pay Teachers and Pinterest. So these are all great places to look for resources for activities to use in the life skills classroom. But we wanted to focus today on how we structure our therapy session and how we structure it into routines where you're able to plug in these various activities that address curriculum.
Right, and I just want to reiterate that the structure is what we'll be focusing on today. The therapy resources that you use, or content, if you will, can come from things that you already have available to you. So we're going to talk about how to structure it, but we've also, for our own benefit, have created this product that already has content in it for us.
Let's talk a minute about routines. We all like routines. We have our morning coffee or tea routines. We have our routine for when we first arrive at work, and we have our routines for winding down at the end of the day. And routines provide us with this familiar framework that's comforting. Consistent routines are also a critical part of speech therapy, especially for students with high needs. Developing a routine is essential for allowing students to understand what's expected and what's coming next, and this allows them to have a lower level of anxiety, and then they're better prepared to learn. Additionally, creating routines provides multiple opportunities for repetition of specific speech and language targets, as well as generalization between content. So once you're using a basic structure of routines in your therapy sessions, you can begin inserting new content into your pre-existing format. And one way to do that is to create a visual schedule, and you see here pictured an example of the pictures that we use for our visual schedule of the different routines that we address throughout the session. And research does show that using a visual schedule can improve comprehension, and again it also alleviates anxiety and allows the students to anticipate what's coming next. Nombres, después música, libro, vamos a hacer una actividad, sí, y sí.
Primero vamos a hacer la pregunta del día. Acabó la pregunta del día. ¿Lo quieres quitar, Cristian?
Sí.
Ese ya se acabó.
Papá.
Ya se acabó. Mira, Edgar, ¿qué sigue? La bolsa de sorpresas primero y luego la música.
So let's say you were ready, you had your visual schedule, the color printer had ink, the laminator was working, the Velcro stocked, you put together this wonderful visual schedule and you know what activities you want to use. But within the same group in your life skills classroom, you have a student who's nonverbal, you have a student who's at the 1 to 2 word utterance level who has significant behaviors, and then you also have a student who's at the 4 to 5 word utterance level. So how are you going to do therapy, and how is it going to be effective for each individual student? I want to take a minute to read this quote that Patricia shared with me from Dr. Lovas, and it says, If a child cannot learn in the way we teach, we must teach in a way the child can learn. So we want to start addressing how to feasibly modify a lesson plan in order to make the content accessible to all students within a diverse group. And Patricia will be getting into specific ways to modify for a variety of levels of students later on in the presentation.
And I also want to mention that when we're planning our routines, we really took into consideration the multimodal approach. And this goes along the lines of children learn in various different ways. So purposefully, we planned to include a lot of visuals, to include a lot of auditory input, kinesthetic input, so that we're accommodating all learning styles in our therapy. This seems like a really short to-do list, but it is pretty time intensive, and there will be a lot of front loading of time in the beginning, especially with this type of a classroom on your caseload. Planning is really important, so we make it a priority at the beginning of the year to sit down with staff and talk about how we can work together and what the expectations are for speech and language, as well as what the expectations are for their academic growth. And we'll show you the method that we used in order to plan with our staff. We also need to consider modifications. Considering modifications can be something that is done during the planning part with the staff, but we'll also have input through observations as well. And we're going to talk about a system of developing appropriate modifications. We also need to gather our materials so that we're well prepared for our therapy sessions, and so that teachers have what they need for their lessons as well to carry over what we're doing in therapy into the classroom and the daily routine. So we'll talk about how to accomplish these tasks during this presentation. This is a template that we like to use. It's what we do when we gather information at the beginning when we plan with our staff. If we're discussing the curriculum, the theme, or the content that is going to be discussed in the coming weeks, there are some speech and language goals, general speech and language goals that sort of jump out at us as speech language pathologists that we can share with teachers just to have in the back of their mind as they're going through these lessons with the students. And we also want to gather information as far as what TEKS or what state standards the teachers are targeting, so that we're conscious that we're incorporating that into our speech therapy sessions as well. And we also like to sit down and discuss possible songs and materials that we'll need to carry out our lessons, and teachers and I often chat about, who's going to bring what and what will be available when. And so this is a great little template to use when planning. This actually comes from a school days unit, so it's got a lot of the TEKS related to school and songs related to school. And so this already has the content in it, but this is just to give you a general idea of how to structure planning in the beginning. Now, the modification part is tricky, and I think a lot of us can identify with MacGyver, especially in the schools. We have to think on the fly, and if something's not working, we've got to make it work, no matter what we need to use, what materials we need to use. But we can use a systematic method to modify appropriately, especially because we know that students in this population are going to have various needs. And so we've developed a system to plan ahead. We look at two different things. First is the physical modifications. We also look at linguistic modifications that I'll be discussing next. For physical modifications, we've broken it down to physical impairments. This means children with low mobility, children in a wheelchair. We look at the needs of children that might have have their specific AAC devices, children with visual impairments, children with hearing impairments, and significant behavior issues. So this is an example of a physical modifications table taken from a unit called My Community, so it's related to that topic. But just so you can see an example, if we have students in our life skills classroom with low mobility and we're expecting them to come up to the board, we can use a felt board or a small board that can come to the students so that they don't have to be expected to walk up and down the classroom. If we have children with AAC devices, for this specific unit, we want to think about the vocabulary that we're going to need ahead of time. Or we might have to create templates for these students, or at least know where to find these items. So peers are going to be something that's very important, family members, places in the community that we go. So if they already have a device, we want to know where to access these words. And if they don't have a device, we want to create templates so that they can be successful during our lessons. For students with visual impairments, we can use tactile objects, real-life objects. For students with hearing impairments, what are going to be some pertinent signs that they can use during the lesson, that just vocabulary that we anticipate will be repeated over and over again. And for students with behavior issues, we want to give them manipulatives. We want to give them individual items that they can be responsible for, so they can have a sense of responsibility and purpose during our therapy lessons. The next table is taking into consideration linguistic modifications. So we've broken it up into 4 different linguistic levels. Students who are nonverbal may be working on skills like joint attention. Students that are nonverbal but intentional and communicate with gestures could be targeting following one-step directions or imitating words. And we think about the words that we're going to be using during this lesson ahead of time so that that's planned out for us. And we have it in English and Spanish on our example because, as I mentioned before, we're bilingual. So all of our therapy materials are in English and Spanish. And for our low verbal children who are at the one-word level, we have chosen target vocabulary words to use during this lesson. And for children who are verbal, we've chosen target sentence structures that we'll be using over and over again during this lesson on My Community. So now that you've planned out your modifications in a systematic way, you can just cruise along with your therapy routine.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit more about what routines we actually are implementing that we found success with. We typically do a question of the day, which serves as a greeting for the beginning of the therapy session. We often do a surprise bag, which is a way to introduce the vocabulary for the topic of the day. We have a song. We'll often include a story with follow-up questions. And then we will at times also add extra activities such as a craft, a recipe, and a game. So some of these routines are integral to every session, and then some of the routines we incorporate sometimes, but not every time. But as you begin to use these routines, the students begin to understand what's expected during each routine, and they become familiar with them, and so they're able to have a lot of success throughout the therapy session. So here we have a video that's going to show you how we set up the routine at the beginning of the therapy session and how we use our visual schedule. So as you're watching the video, just think about the different goals or concepts that you see being addressed during this beginning routine.
¿Qué vamos a hacer? Nombres, después música, libro. Vamos a hacer una actividad, sí, y Primero vamos a hacer la pregunta del día. Se acabó la pregunta del día. ¿Lo quieres quitar, Cristian?
Sí.
Ese ya se acabó.
Papá.
Ya se acabó. Mira, Edgar, ¿qué sigue?
Música.
La bolsa de sorpresas primero y luego la música.
Great. So during the visual schedule, you see that we're able to address labeling. The students are labeling the various activities. And you also see that we're able to address sequencing sequencing concepts as well, such as first we're going to do this, then we're going to do that. We also talk about events being finished. And you also see the students begin to anticipate what's coming next on their own, and they don't even need cues anymore from the speech therapist. And so this shows that they're being successful, and then they feel excited about what they're able to accomplish as well. And then we move on to the question of the day. These are usually a closed question that we use at the beginning of the session to introduce the topic of the day. And this is a great activity to use for the entire group. So you can really modify this activity for all levels within the classroom. So for example, if the topic of the day was pets, the SLP might start by saying, today we're going to talk about pets. Pets are animals that live in our homes. The question of the day is, what is your favorite pet? And then the speech pathologist would provide a picture of a cat and a picture of a dog and perhaps a blank card as well. And then each student can either have a picture of themselves, or they may have a name card with their name written out on it, and each student gets a turn to answer the question. So for your nonverbal students, they're able to take their picture or their name card and place it under their answer, either cat or a dog. And for the students that are at a 1 to 2 word level, they can label what their favorite cat or dog is verbally. And students that are at the 4 to 5 word utterance level may be able to come up with their own answer, something different than a cat and a dog, and that's why we provide that blank option. And then you can also have them practice answering the question with a complete sentence. So this is a great way to be able to include all the students on the same activity. And as Patricia was saying, one modification is to use a felt board. This is a great way, using a felt board can be a great way to get involvement with all the students, even if there is a student with low mobility. And we have a video here that we'd like you to watch, and this is an example of the question of the day, and think about the different goals you see being addressed with this routine, and then also various modifications you see throughout.
La pregunta es, ¿dónde vives tú? ¿Dónde vives tú? ¿Dónde vives? ¿En la casa, en la escuela o en el apartamento?
Ese.
¿En la escuela? ¿Vivimos en la escuela? No, no vivimos en la escuela. ¿Vives en la casa o el apartamento?
Ese.
Ok, tú vives en el apartamento. Cristian vive en el apartamento. Muy bien, bravo, Cristian. Nadie vive en una casa. Todos los niños viven en un apartamento.
Okay. ¿Quién te gusta ser?
No.
¿Policía, limpiador o maestro?
Policía, ¿qué dice Anki de policía?
¿Quién te gusta ser? ¿Quién quiere ser policía? ¿Quiere ser maestra? ¿O limpiador de casa?
Casa.
Ok, muy bien. ¿Y Josefa? ¿Quién quiere ser?
Policía.
Policía, muy bien. Ok, vamos a ver. ¿Cuántas personas quieren ser policía?
No, dos.
Son
Dos.
dos personas
Bien.
quieren ser policía. ¿Y cuántas personas quieren ser limpiador? Uno, muy bien. ¿Cuál tiene más? ¿Policía
Olimpiador.
Policía.
La policía tiene más. Muy bien usted.
Okay, so that video clip showed the same activity being used across different classrooms with a variety of students at different levels of communication skills. And we want to talk about the goals that we saw being addressed and then a couple of modifications as well. So throughout this question of the day routine, we see students answering WH questions. We see them using one-word utterances. We see them using longer phrases as well. And then we're also able to use this routine to address quantitative concepts such as all or none, more, and then numbers as well, such as 1 and 2. And we see that students that were nonverbal were able to point to their answer. We see some of the students using pictures to answer the question, and then some of the students using their name. And also we see a speech therapist helping a student who answered the question incorrectly the first time by saying that he lived at school, but then she was able to use the visuals as a modification to help him be successful. And then you also see in this last clip, the student in the middle, we see some great social interaction going on as well. She sees that her friend picked that he wanted to be a police officer, and you see her patting him on the back, and she's excited because she saw that he answered the question. And then you also see the student at the end saying, yeah, there's 2 students that want to be a police officer. It's me and my friend Angel. So it's kind of cool to see what the students begin to do as they become familiar with the routine and how successful they can be. Okay, and the next routine we often use is a surprise bag, and this is an activity that can be used to introduce the vocabulary for the topic of the day. And this the speech pathologist typically puts either pictures of items or actual objects that could be a modification into the bag that relate with the topic of the day. And then we'll give the students a 3-step direction. So they are told to close their eyes, put their hand in the bag, and take out a surprise. And a great way to introduce this is, again, to talk about the topic of the day. So let's say this time you're talking about vegetables, and you can ask the students to predict what they think might be inside the surprise bag. And so you're accessing prior knowledge to see if they can think of any vegetables on their own, and then continue on with the activity to think of more vegetables. So this activity can be used to work on categories. You can talk about parts of a whole. You can talk about object functions. There's really a lot of speech targets that you can work on with this one activity, and it can also be used to build the knowledge surrounding a concept. So we're going to take a look at another video of the surprise bag routine, and again, think about what goals you see being addressed.
En la bolsa, ¿qué tenemos en la bolsa? Daniel ya sabe que cierra los ojos y mete la mano y saca una foto. A ver, vamos a decir la palabra mesero. Mesero.
¿Bibliotecario? ¿Dónde está? Mira, aquí.
¿El mesero? Mesero. Correcto, mesero está. Ahí está el mesero. Sí, muy bien.
All right, so with the surprise bag, we see that the students are working on following that 3-step direction. They are able to target phonological goals, articulation, labeling, and then we also saw some modifications such as using the communication board to match the surprise bag picture for students that are nonverbal. And throughout this video, you also see the teacher assistants or TAs participating in the therapy sessions and supporting the students throughout, which is great to see that collaboration. Next, I want to talk about using music or songs in speech therapy. So music can be a motivating source for many children to participate in therapy sessions. And while it's a fun activity and it's a great auditory activity as well as it can be a kinesthetic activity if the students are using motions with the song, we know as speech therapists that songs can also be used to assess receptive language. It can be used to work on comprehension and elicit expressive language. So there are a few ways to get the most bang for your buck when using songs. First of all is pre-teaching. So if you've already completed the surprise bag, then chances are you've probably targeted some of the key vocabulary that's going to be in the song. And if there's other vocabulary that you haven't touched on yet, you can do that before beginning the song, which will increase the participation of the students while you're singing. And then another strategy to use is to implement visuals and gestures. So visuals can be a great way to cue the students on what's coming next in the song, and then gestures can be used along with vocabulary to incorporate that kinesthetic multimodal approach, and then it also helps the students solidify the concept of the word as they're singing the song. And then when singing songs with the group, we also recommend using the pause button frequently in order to, this helps to slow down the pace of the song at times, and then it also allows the students an opportunity to follow along. And you can use a lot of strategies such as the closed procedure. So for example, if we're singing Old MacDonald, you might be singing Old MacDonald had
A farm.
So the speech therapist would pause and the students would get to participate by answering a farm. And then the music can continue until the next pause. And this again can be an activity that's done with the whole group of students because you can really use it to break up the seated activities and re-energize the students, and students can participate by gesturing, they can participate by having a job using the visuals and putting the next visual up. They can participate by singing. So every student is able to enjoy this activity. And Patricia and I were talking about it. We were saying how you really could expand just the song routine alone into a 15-minute activity with all of the speech and language that you can target by pausing and talking about what's happening in the song, answering WH questions. So we want to show you another video of how we sometimes use a song in speech therapy, and again, think about the different goals that you see being addressed.
Papá sigue. ¿Dónde está papá? Eso. Y papá es basurero. Vamos a tirar la basura. ¿Pueden hacerlo conmigo? Tira la basura.
Tira la basura.
Anda, ¿tú también? Tira la basura. Eso. Que vamos a empezar con mamá. Mamá primero. Y sigue papá.
Okay, so in the song routine, we saw in that clip that the speech therapist was able to target sequencing concepts, what's next, who's first, who's coming next. They also targeted where questions, vocabulary, and following directions. So a lot was happening with just that short clip that was really 40 seconds of speech therapy.
Stories are a big part of our routine, and as speech pathologists, we all know the value of literacy-based intervention and how much speech and language targets there are within one single story. But I have to tell you, it's been really eye-opening to include this type of a routine using the classroom-based direct model, because it's allowed me to learn a lot from teachers and how they look at books. And I've picked up on little things that are important and what their expectations are when reading a book that I incorporate now, just because I'm reading a story anyway. But I think that collaboration is providing students with a lot of consistency and repetition, and they benefit from that just as much as teachers see a model of a speech pathologist scaffolding and using different modifications in order for children at various levels to participate in a story routine. So we're all benefiting from using stories in therapy. A couple of things that I've picked up on are things like pointing out the title page, talking about what the author does, running my finger across the text from left to right. So these are things that I'm starting to incorporate naturally, and it's a result of the collaborative model. Some modifications that I think about when reading stories are the size of the book. There are a lot of stories that come in the really big classroom-sized book, and so that's great with some life skills classes. For students with behavioral issues, using an individual book, again, giving them a sense of purpose and responsibility and a job to do during therapy sessions, reduces challenging behaviors. We also have ways to modify using low-tech AAC devices. We call them storyboards, and we're going to show you an example of that a few slides down. And so these type of modifications are also a model for the teacher as to how to make story reading an interactive activity and how all students can participate. Choosing a story can be challenging because there's a lot of things to take into consideration with the life skills population at the elementary level. I tend to want to gravitate away from or more towards characters that are human. That way children start relating to the story more, putting themselves in the perspective of the characters. A lot of preschool age storybooks have cutesy animal characters, and so I try to find books that are a little bit higher level and more age appropriate for elementary age students. And of course the text is important, but as speech pathologists we can always modify at their linguistic level. And we also want to choose things that are current, Harry Potter, things that children are interested in, want to talk about with their friends. And then also for vocabulary building, I think nonfiction books are a great way to go as well. For our therapy sessions and our therapy materials, we created our own stories just because we wanted them to directly relate to the content that we were teaching, and we wanted them to have predictive text and have repetitive linguistic targets. So we went ahead and created our own stories, and this is possible nowadays with technology, with apps like Pictello, where you can take pictures and you can write your own stories. So that's a great thing to do as well for this population. Here is a video of the modifications using a story routine.
Yo vi la policía protegiendo mi comunidad.
Muy bien, hermana. Yo vi policía. Vecinos jugando en el parque. Yo vi vecinos.
So you saw students using what we call a storyboard during the storytime routine. We use this sort of a low-tech alternative communication board to enhance linguistic abilities and participation during the storytime routines. We've created these to go along specifically with all of our stories, and we've arranged vocabulary in a specific way so that all the parts of speech stay on either the left or the middle or the right side of the page. This enhances motor memory in children, and I mean, just think about how we use technology and how we use apps and on our smartphones. You know, we want to keep the arrangement the same because this increases our speed and accuracy when we're putting things together. So if somebody went into your smartphone and changed all your apps, it might take you a while to find the email button or the camera button. And so we've structured all of our storyboards in the same way, with the parts of speech the same. We've color-coded the parts of speech, and we've also added dashes, and this was done specifically because we make a lot of copies, and so to have a way to distinguish parts of speech from one another, especially if we're putting sentences together, we can cue students by giving them blank cards with the outline, and so they know that they need to choose a specific vocabulary from one section in each box. This video is an example of a speech therapist using a sentence strip. So basically it's taking target vocabulary and only allowing the child to have a couple of options instead of the whole board to choose from. So it's even more modified than using the storyboard.
Limpia. Casa. ¿Tú haces limpiadora o policía? ¿Cuál haces? ¿Policía? ¿Quieres hacer la policía? Ok. ¿Qué? Toma. La policía, ¿qué hace la policía? ¿Limpia o protege? Ok, protege. ¿Qué protege? Limpia, protege. Personas. Personas.
Tú lo haces igual, ¿verdad? Sí, tú lo haces igual de bien, ¿verdad?
Ay, no veo. Que dime todo. La policía protege personas. Muy bien.
Moving on to another video, we also include questions that we've pre-made to go along with our stories. And our questions include who, what, where questions. Of course, if we have students with more complex questions that are part of their speech language goals, we would think about appropriate questions to ask ahead of time. But these are modified versions of something that children may be expected to do in a general education classroom. So as speech language pathologists, we have the luxury of being able to sit directly with our students and scaffold for them. But what we want is to create activities that they can then take into the classroom and be successful using on their own. So here's an example of that.
¿Caminaron en la playa?
Yeah.
¿Vecindario
Vestidario.
o perro?
Vestidario.
Eso, caminaron en su vecindario. Muy bien.
Okay, so we're going to talk now about a few extra routines that we incorporate just to reinforce the topic of the lesson. And these are great for students that weren't able to participate during the story time or have a harder time during a seated activity. And these last routines provide more of a kinesthetic and tactile approach, and so the students are able to participate. And this is an example of a craft activity for a My Community lesson. And it shows, you can see here that we have visuals, and it's set up into a sequence of 5. So again, you can use this to modify for each of your students using the visuals. For students that are higher level, you can talk about the sequence of activities. You can have the students get the materials and then also request the different materials throughout the craft, and at the end they can discuss how they created it. So again, you can really modify this activity to make it more difficult or to make it easier. And here's a recipe. This is another extremely functional real-world application of the curriculum and another hands-on activity that a lot of students may enjoy. And lastly, we use a game routine, and this can be a fun interactive way for the students to get exposure again to the theme-based vocabulary. And here you see an example of a match game, but we often will also use a bingo game or a fishing game, and these are great ways to target speech and language goals within a real-world activity, which also targets pragmatic skills such as turn-taking and establishing eye contact and winning and losing graciously.
That concludes our presentation. Thank you all for attending, and we want to invite you to visit us at bilinguistics.com. Click on our resource library tab. There's a lot of downloadable materials that you can use. We also have a music for speech therapy page that you can visit for suggested songs, and I believe there are also visuals that you can download as well. And if you're interested in our life skills book, you can visit the product tab.